Hello, my friends. Welcome to another episode of Developmental Psychology. Today we're going to be doing the final textbook chapter, chapter 13, where we're looking at we're looking at death, dying, and bereavement, and all the complexity and all the, psychological and social and emotional and spiritual and physical aspects of this complicated dynamic. So, I got some videos in this one. I got a bunch of notes here, and welcome. Grab a coffee, and I hope you enjoy this. All right, cheers, take care, and let's get into it. For most people, death happens in late adulthood. However, many younger individuals contract fatal diseases or may die in an accident. Thus, like most developmental events, the timing and mode of a particular individual's death affect its meaning and its effect on others. Medical personnel distinguish between clinical death, brain death, and social death. In the industrial world, death most often occurs in hospitals. For the terminally ill, hospice workers and facilities provide an alternative form of care for some. By the age of 6 or 7, most children understand that death is permanent. Teens sometimes have distorted ideas about death, especially their own mortality. Many young adults see themselves as invulnerable to death. For middle-aged adults, the death of a loved one, often apparent, signals a change in social roles. Among the middle-aged, fear of death is common. This is just an intro, by the way, so don't worry about scrambling down notes. Older adults fear death less, especially those who are very religious. Preparation for death may include practical activities such as writing a will. Many dying adults also prepare by sharing life experiences with younger family members. Some dying adults exhibit dramatic changes in cognitive and physical functioning just prior to death, a phenomenon known as terminal drop. These are all things we're going to be talking about today, and I'm just kind of explaining the second point there on the slide, this idea that death is a process and a state. So I'd like you to have that. A process, well, you know what process means, and a state means it's also being experienced, and moment by moment by moment by moment. Those moments in a row are the process. Each individual moment is the state that's being experienced at that time. Right? So the first point there, we use death as if it's just like some specific word, which it, at a certain point is, but we're gonna, because there's obviously a biological, but even that, we're going to talk about what brain death even is. So we're going to talk about that level of analysis, but we're also going to be talking about the experience. And I want to try to, in this presentation, look at the experience both from the perspective of the dying individual and of the experience of the loss of that person for the people that care about that person and the people providing care to that person. Okay, so that's where, and this is where we're going to address some of the work of Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages of dying. And you've heard of this before, but I want to position this maybe a little bit differently. And I want to talk about how, again, it's almost like some of the arguments you've heard me make of people that critique Freud. It's like it's a bit easier to come after and critique the model. It's like Kubler-Ross really kind of got people talking about this idea of the psychological process. You've heard this before, maybe denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. We'll get into it later. You can write it down later. And then we're going to look at like that kind of how people have challenged that or built on that. Or it's an interesting idea because then Kubler-Ross, and I'll talk about this more in detail later, but kind of originally designed it aimed at the experience of the person dying, and then kind of later broadened it to be relevant to grief more generally. So just the reason I went on that rant is just my next point here is Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of dying have been widely studied. Research suggests that not all dying individuals go through these stages, and critics of this model suggest that her stages may be somewhat culturally specific, and again, it's just another one of these. The process of adjusting to death may not be as stage oriented. So this is going to be a model, and not just stage models, any kind of conceptual model often is limited in the fact that it's an overgeneralization. But again, that's almost like a critique of models in general. Attitudes appear to affect a terminally ill individual's longevity. I'm going to talk about that. I shouldn't have just kind of backed into that sentence, because this is a really super important point, that attitudes appear to attitudes appear to affect a terminally ill individual's longevity, meaning like the attitude a person has actually seems to have an effect biologically on longevity. And we'll connect that to the work of Dr. Frankl later. Those who have a fighting spirit, and it has here, this is like an intro piece from the text, and those who have a fighting spirit, in quotes, survive longer than do peers who are resigned to the inevitability of death. Psychoanalytic theory emphasizes the traumatic nature of grief and the defense mechanisms that often accompany the experience. Attachment theorists suggest the grieving involves a series of stages across which the bereaved adjust to life without the deceased. Alternative approaches emphasize the individual nature of grieving, claiming that the experience is poorly explained by general theories. Then we'll also talk about how, these are kind of just an overview of all of our topics for today. Funerals and other rituals redefine the roles of the bereaved, bringing families together and giving meaning to the lives of both the deceased and the bereaved. Grief responses depend on the age and mode of the dead, or of the death of the deceased, right? So it depends on how old they were and how they died and the characteristics of the people that loved them. Losing a spouse appears to bring upon some of the most intense types of grief. So we're going to spend a bit of time looking at widows and the effect that, widows and widowers. So that was kind of a long intro. Sorry about that. I wanted to sort of set the tone here that, like, yeah, most of us use this word death we all know what the word means. But it has such a deep, so many layers to it. And I'm going to try to address this topic as the best that I can. And I understand that, like, for some people, they may have went through a loss relatively recently, and it's sort of interesting. It's like, I think I've certainly been affected by this type of loss in my life, but not super recently. And it's interesting because, maybe it's helpful to talk about it, and it's also taught when you're going through things, but also to look at it when you're not going through things and understand it better, so that when you then are going through it later, because we're all going to be dealing with stuff at different times in our life, and it's also, part of it is processing, but another part of it is developing an ability to better process in the moment, in the future. And what I mean by that is some of it is developing a framework for understanding this, and because a lot of you are going to maybe be working with people that are going through this final stage of life, or maybe you're supporting kids that are trying to make sense of a lost parent, or maybe you're dealing with people with complex situations and complicated experiences of grief. So a clinical death is when a person is in a place where they're not producing vital signs, so pulse, breathing, but that theoretically they could still be rescued. Right, so it says that I have there, like, presumably that a near-death experience would be that kind of a situation, right? That somebody was like, almost like, for lack of a better way of saying it, just about to die and somebody saved them. We call brain death when there's an absence of vital signs. We're not seeing any brain activity. And keep in mind that brain activity is actually, when you think of what's keeping somebody alive, it's basically a list of brain activity, heart, lungs. And so the brain's not sending the signal to breathe or to the signal to the rhythm of the heart anymore. The person's considered legally dead. Yeah, and then that other term, social death, the point at which family members and medical personnel treat the deceased as a corpse. Family and friends must begin to deal with the loss. And we're going to talk about how a big piece of the social death is, it's to a lot of people, it's why in a lot of religious traditions the funeral is such an important thing. It's a very physical thing. It's not just a death isn't just a psychological thing and an emotional or social thing. It's actually a physical thing in the showing the person respect through the dignified way of honoring their remains. And one of the things I want to talk about today is this idea of how what the effect's been on people having huge pieces of that denied to them, right? Well, even just in our current situation with the lockdown and having limits on funerals and stuff like that. And there's an article I'm going to share later that kind of addresses it directly. So today I should almost say, like, there's going to be some difficult topics I talk about today. Yeah, and I think the very next one we're going to talk about medically assisted suicide, and the topic of suicide will come up in a few different ways today. So, but again, I'm going to be doing this as these are super important conversations. It's like in developmental psychology, it's from the beginning to the end, and as I was saying kind of in an earlier slide, like a lot of you are going to be helping professionals dealing with people experiencing sometimes tragedy, and being able to conceptualize it and understand it and function in that kind of environment is super important. So there's obviously cultural variations that shape how people experience death and their attitudes about it, and some of the cultural things are religious, some of them are traditional, some are at the kind of community or national level. And we'll talk about some of those things. Some of them are time-based too, right? Like people in different time periods, different times in the history of humanity having different rituals around when loved ones passed. We're going to talk about how, because this is saying like different kind of historical, and cultural kind of context factors, that when people are in situations of incredible trauma and strife, times of war, famine, plague, the likelihood of, there's a bigger propensity there's a bigger likelihood of thinking and contemplating death when it's right in your experience, when it's right in your face. And then we're going to talk about how, and this is going to kind of, at points, we're going to touch on how religious coping plays a role for people. And again, in this class, we're going to be kind of really trying to look at this from what developmental psychology has to say about these things, but where it also touches into other areas. For some, death means loneliness. And again, we're going to also talk about how what people think is going to happen after death affects their experience of the time leading up to it. There's a lot of complexity around this, and also and what the role the other people around that person play in it. 200 years ago, almost 1 out of every 2 children died before the age of 10, and 1 parent died before the children would grow up. According to Statistics Canada, a century later, in the early 20th century, about 1 in 10 Canadian babies died either at birth or in the first year of life. More recent statistics sharply contrast. In 2011, 1 in 200, so that's from 1 in 10, 1 in 200 children died within the first year of life. Life expectancy has increased from 58.8 years for a man born in 1922 to 79.3 years now, and from 60.6 years to 83.6 years for a woman in Canada. The combined effect of childhood immunization, increased health awareness, sanitation and nutritional practices, quality health care, improved workplace safety, and practices such as wearing seatbelts have contributed to the effects of this longevity, according to Statistics Canada. Indigenous populations within Canada have a life expectancy that's on average roughly 5 years shorter than Canada in general, which is quite heartbreaking. Okay, so yeah, and just this idea that, right, humans, as far back as we can trace the archaeological, like we even think Neanderthals were burying their dead, as far back as humans go, but you know, even it's as old as humans to try to have to make sense of the loss of loved ones and the whole issue of mortality at a personal level. So there's sort of two things going on in this entire conversation. It's a very personal thing, and it's also something that happens in our social world, which you obviously know, but it's just interesting to be looking at this through this constant dual lens of us dealing with our own mortality and of us experiencing loss, and for you, a lot of you, potentially working with people experiencing loss, right? Which is almost a triangle of that, where it's your own mortality, your own social life experiences of it, and then also helping people in a professional context where you need to be present with them and helping them. Right, so the demands to understand it and be able to take care of yourself through that process are going to be really important to long-term productivity and success, and you know, your own self-care and functionality. There's this kind of interesting point that when we look at how death's understood across the lifespan, like as adults, we understand that death's irreversible, that people aren't going to come back, that it's something that's going to happen to all of us, that it's the cessation, like the ending, to cease, to end of all function, meaning basically it's the end of the road. But that children, especially young children, even teenagers, and how they, not necessarily in how they understand that specifically, but how they relate to that, differ. And a lot of the difference when we look at how children and teenagers and adults describe their experience around death, it's very interesting that a lot of it comes to this idea of how they try to make sense of the irreversibility, this idea that it's everyone has to deal with mortality, the second part, and then the third part, that it's finite, that it's like an endpoint, a solid endpoint, right? And again, you know, you all know what I mean, but that's part of the complexity of this topic. So I wanted to just kind of add a little bit to this, and you don't have to write this down again because I'm kind of just repackaging the first point there, that to a lot of younger kids, what they're having difficulty understanding is this idea of irreversibility, right? That it's final, and that it's something that happens to everybody, and even animals, and it's a part of life and how it fits in with the cycle of everything. And a lot of times that's maybe where the conversations are about, and maybe you're using something like Charlie Brown, and it's like I kind of intentionally use this image that I found, right? Because you're looking at ways to try to, and again, it's obviously going to depend on the age of the child and the relationship and the cognitive ability of the child and how they're making sense of it. And teaching young children about the nature of biological life can help them understand what causes death and why it's irreversible. Right? And it's this idea that by the time a kid gets to like school age, they start to understand that there's this permanence, this universality. That second point there comes to everyone. That's the universality of death. So again, remember, you're actually not getting tested on this specifically. So the last assignment that we're going to do, and I'll make a video obviously and produce content just about that specifically, but you'll be able to talk about stuff related to this video and conceptually touch on it, but you don't have to, there's no quiz on it. But if you're still taking notes, or if you're still in this idea of building the concepts glossary for the course or whatever, personal fable is a great word. And it's this idea that you've probably experienced in yourself, this idea of kind of, we all know that we're not in a movie that's about us, but part of our perceptual experience makes it feel like we're in this movie that's sort of our own movie. And that kind of is something that is, well, it's talked about in a lot of different ways in sociology. George Herbert Mead talks about it as like a generalized other, and Charles Cooley Mead talks about it as a looking glass self, that we actually start to see ourselves as how we think other people see us, and it's like this caricature, almost like as if it was, what's a caricature, like almost like a character in a show, in your own movie, a hypothetical life story created for him or herself. And that this is linked with this idea of feeling this unique invulnerability. Adolescents understand the finality of death better than children do, and in an abstract sense they understand that death's inevitable, but that this idea of personal fable can contribute to the frequency of teenagers' potentially fatal risky behaviors, and this idea of like it couldn't happen to them. Yeah, and I have here written down this idea of unique invulnerability, that like for some reason they're invulnerable when other people are. And that not only is that normal for teenagers to experience that, it's almost characteristic of the teenage experience. And that's why it's so important to understand if you're supporting teens. That how, because again, remember, part of what we're going to be talking about today is how the experience of this, especially if you're supporting people in some of your potential future roles, you're going to be helping them process it. And part of what that actually literally means is how it impacts their understanding of their own story, of their relational story, and of kind of their understanding of the broader world. So when we're in adulthood, again, this is just sort of looking at this idea of like age still is a factor. Like in early adulthood, sometimes the experience of having people in our lives pass on can really shake people to the core, and really shake this kind of what I mentioned before, is this unique invulnerability. And so sometimes for young adults it can be, although it's tragic for everyone, even more tragic than the experience, or traumatic than the, or tragic and traumatic than the experience on older adults. Because for the younger adults it also includes that kind of hit to the core and makes them question this idea of, or just, again, like I've said it a few times, but questioning their own mortality or thinking about their own mortality. And when people have personal experiences, it actually changes how they make sense of death. And examples of this could be like looking at people that are in the healthcare profession. And it's a tough second sub point there, that the loss of a loved one can increase the likelihood of an individual to have intrusive suicidal thoughts. And that's an important thing to understand at both a personal and a professional level as students entering helping professions. We also see that when there's the death of a famous celebrity, especially if that celebrity is young, that can have a real shocking effect on teenagers especially, right? Because it's like nothing shocks their sense of invincibility more than seeing somebody that's sort of like them, especially someone that maybe they look up to. So it's interesting. It's like, yeah, we're really just looking at different levels of processing depending on sort of developmental stage. So a death changes the roles and relationships of everybody in the family and the people even beyond the family, and there can be this destabilizing effect. And I don't have to tell anybody that, everybody already knows that, but it's important to mention this idea of how it has this butterfly effect chain reaction through the social and emotional dynamics that exist to everyone that touches that system. I have there that, yeah, death brings permanent changes in the dynamics of families and in social systems. In middle age, many individuals switch the way that they think about time, even from, and like I've jokingly talked about that idea that like this summer I'm turning 40, and it's like, if I have another 40 years, that's a pretty good life. And it's like, that's exactly that idea of switching from thinking of time since birth to time till death. Those middle-aged and older adults who continue to be preoccupied with the past are more likely to be fearful and anxious about death. That's an interesting point. We're going to get into that a little bit later, of what kind of thought processes, behaviors, and social patterns are associated with being more or less fearful of death in those final days. So you've heard me talk before about logotherapy and Viktor Frankl, and you maybe even have heard me talk about Martin Seligman and what's called positive psychology, right? So these are two branches of psychology we've talked about before. And then existential psychology is sort of another branch. And what existential psychology is focused on is, you can kind of just understand by understanding the word existential, existence, you can sort of see in there. So existentialists, philosophically, so existential philosophers and existential psychologists are interested in things about existence. So you'll hear people say things like existential anxiety, like fear of death, fear of, well, all these 6 things, these 6 existential uncertainties. The fact that death is final, the fact of uncertainty around what's next. Right? And so some people, especially, and sometimes that's the most traumatic for people that don't view themselves as religious and don't have a belief system about that. This idea of, there can be existential anxiety around the idea of annihilation, or this concept of like you not existing anymore, at like the deepest level of what that could even mean. Like an identity experience of what's you. Yeah, I should have just read the rest of that. A fear of non-existence. That's a better way of saying it. The ultimate loss, right? This idea of he goes into it in this piece I'm going to show next, but the ultimate loss, meaning like the greatest gift of life, and this idea of not having that, the fear of the pain of loneliness, the fear of not completing what you were meant to complete, whether that's your life work, or he even talks about like sometimes that's a relational thing. Maybe your life work was supposed to be, maybe it, or not supposed to be, but maybe it had components that were also related to things like family and community and the next generation. Okay, so the really interesting idea here by what Dr. Paul Wong is doing is really trying to create a conceptual marriage between existential psychology and positive psychology. So what's on the next slide is a little bit different. And what I did was I used Zoom. I've done this twice for this presentation in 2 different spots, but the next one's the first time you'll see this, where basically I did a screen share article review in Zoom and then just inserted the video straight into this so that you don't have a bunch of different things. You just have one big video file. So let's hope that this all works nicely. This is a monster file. Before I even started recording myself, it was like 2 gigs already. So hopefully this might take a while to upload, but I hope you find it cool. All right. So I'll see you after in 2 slides. Okay, so I got another article for you, but at this point my daughter's home. She's downstairs watching Rapunzel, so I have a few minutes and I was going to add this later, but it's kind of a longer article and it might work a little bit better if I pre-record this and add it as a video and then hopefully get through it smoothly in one go. So I hope this works okay with me, like beside the video, but I brought the decent mic up, so hopefully it sounds okay. This is this Paul Wong that I had shown on the previous slide, the 6-piece model, and this is called Existential Positive Psychology. Okay, so posted by Paul Wong, 2015, Existential Psychology, Meaning Therapy, Positive Psychology, Writing. I guess those are just the tag words. So the abstract, let me go, I'll use the scroller. Existential psychology is about human existence and the human drama of survival and flourishing. It is inherently positive because it emphasizes the courage and responsibility of confronting existential anxieties and living an authentic life. Unfortunately, the popular existential literature tends to focus on the darker side of the human condition. Yeah, that's certainly true. Existential psychology can learn from positive psychology's scientific method and focus on the positive. So you're going to see the emergence in this article of this term, positive existential psychology, right? So you can see this is the combination of positive psychology principles and existential psychology. Positive psychology, PP, has now come full circle to its existential roots. Positive psychology is intrinsically existential because it is concerned with such fundamental questions about human existence as what is the good life? What makes life worth living? How can one find happiness? However, these existential questions cannot be fully addressed through positive psychology research alone without recognizing people's existential anxieties. Yeah, a maturing positive psychology needs a return to its existential humanist roots to rediscover the richness of lived experience and the many pathways to meaning in life. Right, so this article is pretty cool. So all these questions, right? So existential positive psychology, or EPP. So see how it's the combination of existential thought and positive psychology thought. So you see there it says one or the other, and all it does is switch the first, second word. Or positive existential psychology represents a natural combination between the two. Basically, EPP addresses a few fundamental questions about self-identity and the human condition of striving for happiness within the constraints of reality. Exactly. Who am I? What defines me? Who am I? Even when, I don't know if that came on the screen or not, that reminder. Anyways, Who am I when everything is stripped away from me and I'm reduced to a naked, lonely soul? That's a tough question. Is there anything unique and special about me? How can I be happy? Why am I bored? Why am I so dissatisfied with my life? What is the good life? Is this all there is to life? These are existential questions. These are being listed as examples of existential questions. Right? How do I make the right choices? What should I do with my life? Where do I belong? Why do I feel so alone in this world? How can I develop a sense of meaning in my relationships and find acceptance? Where's home? What's the point of striving when life is so short? Why should I struggle to survive when life is transient and fragile? And what's the point of building something only to be swallowed by death? All these questions are related to the human processes of making sense and finding a purpose or a reason for existence. It is the spirit of asking tough questions and rejecting pre-packaged easy answers that characterizes existential psychology. Great point. EPP is open to insights, wisdoms, and facts of life from all sources, regardless of the paradigm of knowledge claims, thus providing a richer research agenda. In short, EPP broadens the definition of positive psychology as the study of ultimate concerns through integrating both positive and negative aspects of the human condition in order to create a better future for self and others. What qualifies EPP as positive psychology is its emphasis on the human capacity for positive growth and change. Change and growth. It's funny I said that backwards. Yalom. So Yalem's a really interesting person to look into too, Irvin Yalom. Really big name in group psychology. Yalom has already identified 4 existential anxieties: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. How we confront and resolve these existential givens is related to the courage and creativity we can muster. I've just added 2 more existential questions related to identity and happiness. These 6 issues are the recurrent themes of human existence, even if they remain unconscious or latent in some individuals. Yeah, so it's interesting. I might not read the whole thing because it's super long, but I want to read just this one piece, okay? So it kind of breaks down all, this is a cool article, but I just want to read this part from identity crisis to the quest for authenticity. Identity crisis is not limited to adolescence. It can be an ongoing struggle to define and redefine ourselves when we go through major life transitions and upheavals. The search for identity requires self-knowledge. The ancient Delphic injunction carved into the litanal at the temple of Apollo, know thyself, still resonates with the postmodern generations. Without a clear sense of self-knowledge, we can go through life without even knowing who we are and what we really want in life. The discomfort of identity crisis is necessary for initiating the quest for authenticity. However, defense mechanisms also often keep identity anxiety at bay, and social pressures of conformity and enculturation provides an easy escape for this existential quest. The dehumanization of a competitive capitalist society further narrows people's vision to material gains. As a result, people are confused about their true identity in the larger scheme of things. Thus, the quest for the authentic, or the quest for authenticity, remains a challenging and poignant task in a consumer culture. Yeah, exactly. I just want to read these next 2 paragraphs and then I'll finish this video. Okay, authenticity has been a recurrent theme in the existential literature. Heidegger differentiates between the non-authentic and the authentic mode of living. The non-authentic people give up their individuality and responsibility for the security of being part of the herd. In contrast, the authentic people assume responsibility to live in a way that's consistent with their true nature and core values. They strive to become what they were made to be, in spite of the anxiety and risk involved. There is no shortcuts to authenticity. Test scores on personality, vocational interests, and signature strengths can be helpful, but there's no passion in cold numbers, no inspiration in formulas. The process of authentication often begins with a moment of awakening,
a deepening of conviction about core values and a felt sense of one's true identity. If it is the discovery of an inner vision about one's own uniqueness and singularity that endows life with deeper meaning. It's a well-written article. But this is just the start. The pathway to authenticity entails risks, setbacks, and sufferings, especially when it's contrary to social norms. In many instances, the quest for authenticity means persecution and death, because those who dare to march to a different drum and challenge the status quo are likely to be maligned, marginalized, even martyred. Thus, the quest for authenticity and meaning is not always compatible with the pursuit of happiness and a good life. To live an authentic and meaningful life means that one cannot deny one's true nature, and calling even if it means death. Jesus is case in point, so is Socrates. It's interesting that they say that. That's an interesting narrative addition there by the author. Both of them died for what they said. From an existential perspective, authentic happiness flows from the authentic mode of living. Quoting Alfred Camus's rhetorical question, but what is happiness except the simple harmony between a man and the life he leads? You're equating happiness with harmony of living. According to Schumacher, this harmony can be achieved not just by doing what one is best at, but also by living like human beings who need social connection and spirituality. Yeah, so interesting. This is a pretty neat article. All right, so I'll let you read the rest of that. It's actually a super long article. I'm only on like point 1 of 6, so but now you kind of got the feel of it, and here's the link of it is in the presentation. See you back from downstairs in the main lab.
For young adults, the sense of unique invulnerability probably prevents intense fears of death. Right? So there's, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say defense mechanism aspect of it, but you probably know what I mean by that. There's a protective function. That's a better way maybe of saying it. Although defense mechanisms are protective functions, so it's just trying to say the same thing differently. Middle-aged adults are most fearful of death, which is sort of interesting, right? Not late adults. In middle age, a belief in one's own immortality begins to break down, right? So immortality is the opposite of mortality, obviously, resulting in an increasing anxiety about the end of life. By late life, the inevitability of death has been accepted, and anxieties are focused on how death will eventually come about. Older adults are more likely to fear the period of uncertainty before death than they are to fear death itself. That's an interesting kind of finding from the literature, that people are more likely to be afraid of, well, quite literally how they're going to die than dying. So here's another point that's just another piece of evidence for how humans are so infinitely complex and interesting, that it's both those people that are deeply religious and those people that aren't religious at all who seem to report the least fear of death. So the people that are the least afraid of death are the people that are either very religious or people that aren't religious at all. So the way you would study this, right, is obviously, or maybe not obviously, from a scale construction perspective, there'd have to be two scales there. One that measures degree of like religious, psychological, and maybe social participatory involvement. So like a religious engagement scale, and then a fear of death scale, right? And then you see what the correlation between those are. Does a score in one predict a score in the other? And what you see is that you can just do some pretty straightforward statistical analysis on that. And so what they find, though, sorry to go so much on that over detail, what they find is that the people that score on the extreme ends are the ones that deal best with it. And it seems like the people, like it mentions there, the most fearful may be those who are uncertain about or uncommitted to any religious or philosophical tradition. That religious beliefs may moderate fears of death. It might actually help people deal with it, and moderate means like make them less intense. Right, and keep in mind, being completely unreligious is sort of a religious position. There are people that aren't religious don't like to hear that probably, but like, if you have a complex belief system that's focused on the idea that God doesn't exist in the universe, and you have complex reasons for that, you can maybe not call it a religion if you don't want to, but it's a complex metaphysics. And so it's different than that second category of people that are uncertain or uncommitted to any kind of, I actually say it there, I say religious or philosophical tradition. So there's to kind of capture that complexity of it doesn't, I'm not kind of just talking about religion, and there's a reason why I'm also kind of touching on existentialism a lot, because again, it's a complex thing that people engage differently depending on their understanding of themselves, their world, their upbringing, their cultural situation, their age. And that religious influences seem to, so this idea that death is seen as a transition from one form of life to another, or the idea that the belief in God, actually what we see is that people tend to believe in God more as they get older. It's interesting to look at how that relates directly to something, and this is kind of the point, but it's interesting to think of that in the context of how it specifically relates to contemplation about mortality.
No matter how hard I try, I cannot recall what it was like being dead. I know that I was, but I have no idea what it was like. I was actually dead for a pretty long time too. Based on what I've been told, I was dead for between 13.7 and 13.8 billion years. Regardless of whether we want to admit it, we all fear death. The awareness of our impending mortality is one of, if not the most influencing force on our experience of life. The things we do, the thoughts we have, the feelings we experience. Everything is driven by both our unconscious nature to stay clear of death and our conscious awareness of the fact that at some point we will have to face it. Our bodies and minds are mere rentals gifted to us by the universe for a vacation of conscious physical existence, and at some point they must be returned. The place in which they return to, however, is the same place in which we received them from. Whatever that experience of no experience was before I was born, the 13.73 billion years of time, energy, and matter that I can't recall or describe, the thing that I manifested out of, and the thing that I would dissolve back into. I have already experienced it. You have already experienced it. We have all already experienced it. Even if you believe that your spirit, soul, energy, or whatever else you might call it is infinite, then its infiniteness must go both forward and back. If you believe in an afterlife, then in principle there must be a before life, because if you end up somewhere after physical conscious form, then you must have come from somewhere before physical conscious form. And if you argue that you must be born physically to access an afterlife, you are declaring that you must be a physical entity to access a non-physical thing, which completely folds in on itself. Arguably, no matter how hard we might try to paint a picture of something different after this life, there appears to be no way around the idea that in terms of personal experience, whatever came before our life is what will essentially come after. This means that you have been dead before. You know what it is like. To your conscious, subjective self, for lack of better terms, it is like absolutely nothing. This nothing is not the sort of nothing that we typically consider nothing to be. It is a nothing that we cannot describe, understand, or recall. A subsistence far beyond our consciousness and sense of self. Something that doesn't require either, and thus to our consciousness and sense of self, it is nothing. This nothing, however, is not scary. Before you were born, you were perfectly fine with this nothing, perhaps more fine than you can even fathom. Being dead is not scary. The conscious thought of dying without being at terms with it is scary. Naturally, coming to terms with our mortality is extremely difficult. We rarely ever discuss or address it at a level of self-honesty and vulnerability. It is rare that death, in any real sense, comes up in conversation, and it is rare that we ever deeply meditate on the fact that we will all die sometime in the relatively near future. However, it is essential that we do confront the thought of death regularly and honestly. By becoming deeply aware of our mortality, we intensify our experience of every aspect of life, writes author Robert Greene. No matter what we do to veil or distract ourselves away from the awareness of death, the awareness will continue to buzz inside of us. When we do not address and embrace the buzzing, it only becomes louder and more intrusive. It causes us to feel intensifying levels of anxiety, aversion, and disorientation. Instead, we must learn how to live with this buzzing and transmute it into the sound of life itself. We must accept death as an essential part of life. Doing things the second time around is almost always less intimidating than the first. So if we consider the idea that we have already experienced what it means to be dead and come to terms with the fact that we will experience it again and be totally and utterly okay, then death becomes easier to face, easier to reduce our fear and apprehension towards. To reduce our fear of death is to crack open the door to life itself. We become more inspired to do things that are interesting, exciting, and fulfilling, rather than being stuck in a cycle of wasting time, feeling anxious, and latching onto material distractions. At some point, we will lose our ability to experience things as we know them. Like it or not, that is the condition of our human experience. If we wish to make the most of our human experience, instead of living in spite of its conditions, we must accept them. Like a vacation to our favorite destination, we should not let our awareness of the trip's end date ruin our vacation. For if a vacation went on forever, it would no longer be a vacation at all. Against all odds, we were given the opportunity to go on this vacation, to experience nature perceiving itself. Ironically, our fear of losing our ability to experience this is what can ruin our ability to ever actually enjoy it, and we mustn't let this happen and squander such a gift. More than death itself, we should fear never overcoming the idea of death while we are alive. We should fear not appreciating life and death for what they are while we can. Thank you for watching. If you found enjoyment and value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are not already, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We are constantly coming out with new videos to help you experience life with clarity and wonder.
I hoped you found that last video sort of interesting. I know it was maybe a little bit weird and a little bit different, but my idea was to present you with an existential interpretation of this, to just sort of show what I mean by it, because it's actually a very highly developed conceptual system. So in this course, we've spent a lot of time talking about the work, just to switch to this slide now, with this course we've spent a lot of time talking about the work of Erikson, and just to touch on his idea again and how this relates to what we had spent a bunch of time last presentation focused on with the concept of ego integrity and despair. There's this idea that a person's sense of subjective self-worth, or we were talking about it as integrity, but just this subjective meaning, it's not somebody else's score of how good your life was. It's when you're looking at yourself, your subjective personal worth. Right? That adults who have accomplished goals or believe they've become the person they set out to be tend to report having less fear of death. Belief that life has purpose or meaning reduces fear of death. And that there's a lot of kind of at least conceptual consistency in linking this with Erikson's theory of ego integrity versus despair. So for this slide of preparation for death, and that again, this is sort of from the perspective of the person that's dying, and I in my own heart really respectfully use this image of the lone wolf who separated itself in that picture there from the pack, and is. So I don't know if you know, but I'm really into animal behavioral psychology too, and it's very interesting how wolves do that, how wolves will separate themselves from the pack and kind of die alone, so that, well, for a whole variety of reasons, but that there's this psychology of pulling away at the end, and we can label it whatever we want. We can make up theories like, or labels like we used last week, like disengagement theory, or but the psychology is so deep, and you can see it sometimes in even very practical things people do, like, and I'm not saying that any of this is bad, but it's preparatory behavior, right? Behavior done in an effort to prepare. Preparations that are more common as people start to move towards late adulthood and are more accepting of the inevitability of death. They start to do things like make wills and have life insurance. At a somewhat deeper psychological level, adults may also prepare through this process of reminiscence. We talked about that a lot last presentation, or reminiscence meaning thinking back about memories about your own life and the sort of story around it. Deeper still, there may be unconscious changes that occur in the years just before death that we think of as a type of preparation. And even though that's vague, it's sort of intentionally vague, because I think it's a deep comment that there's a type of preparation that seems to be deeply unconscious. And I think that's sort of what I was meaning by including this wolf picture, that there's a bit of a mysterious element to that. There's obviously maybe a biological, well, obviously there's like a biological component and a evolutionary component and a biochemical component, but it's such an interesting, fascinating dynamic, I think. So this is just a quick slide, but here's a word related to this: thanatology, or the scientific study of death and dying. And Thanatos was an ancient Greek deity related to, well, he was the embodiment of death. I should have said, well, the embodiment, the personification would have been a better word than embodiment, but right? Because embodiment means to take the body of like an idea or whatever. But the personification means that's like the picture of death, right? So that's just where that word comes from. It's also probably why Freud used a reference to that to refer to the death instinct in some of his theories, right? So that's just the word that specifies that. Remember, ology always means the scientific study of death and dying. So on the topic of studying death and dying as a psychological experience for both the individual going through it and those around them, the classic in the field is the book On Death and Dying by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So in the 1960s, a Swiss-American psychiatrist, Kubler-Ross, formulated a model that asserted that those who are dying go through a series of psychological stages. And as I mentioned at the very first slide of this presentation, you've probably heard of this before. It's a very common idea that's heavily infiltrated, or I should just say like spread into pop culture. But that's because it was such a strong concept model. It's a very interesting idea, and then people have challenged it on certain aspects, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, this all started with this original book. So Kubler-Ross had this idea that you needed to understand these 5 stages, and I won't spend a ton of time on this because I'll kind of assume that you've maybe heard of this, or maybe I'll just, from this perspective, I'll say that she's saying that it's so complex that people almost well, in some ways it's similar to Erikson's psychosocial stage model, where he had this idea that there's this developmental path, and Kubler-Ross's model is almost on a smaller time scale, but that there's almost this developmental process through the experience of traumatic loss, and that it's characterized by these emotional states that seem to have a sequence to them. And what we're going to see in a minute is that a lot of the critique is maybe the order, or people saying like that there's more fluctuation between stages than her model suggests. But in general, I think she's really onto something, that people tend to have this experience of denial and at first, and that tends to transform into anger, and then bargaining or trying to find a solution or a way out, or to make some kind of deal, or sometimes the bargaining is with God, and then people sometimes go through periods of depression and eventually acceptance. But as it says at the bottom, some of the critiques are that the stages maybe aren't as fixed as Kubler-Ross's model implies, right? But again, you've heard me rant on this before, so I won't hit you with this long rant again, but in some ways that's kind of just a generalized critique of any kind of stage model. Right, because they said that about Freud's psychosexual model. We said that about Erikson's psychosocial model. We said that about the model of the human mind as memory. Any conceptual model is somewhat limited as an overgeneralization. That's sort of the idea, though, of modeling generalizable concepts. There's always a little bit of sacrifice of individual relevance. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, right, in developmental psychology, when you're trying to get at the core of human experience. And it is a difficult thing because humans are infinitely diverse in so many ways. So I have 2 models here that, just in case people are interested in this and want to look a little bit further into Kubler-Ross's ideas. And some people have kind of played with this, and you'll notice some of the labels are a little bit different. But I wanted to put this and then the next picture up because there's just sort of different ways. Like this model's looking at the different states, the reactions and approaches that people experience as they're going through these different changes in the curve, because what happened over time is that Kubler-Ross originally designed her model, and I mentioned this before, but just to add a little bit more, she originally designed the model to help understand the experience of dying, not the experience of somebody that had a loved one die, but the experience of actually being the person at the end of life. But then the book got really popular and people were using it in a variety of situations, and so she kind of expanded the theory, right? Or just made it also kind of a little bit more tailored, or a little bit more aimed at the experience of the grieving family, basically. So here's just another version of the same idea. So if you just Googled like the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, you'd find that people have applied it in hundreds and thousands of different ways. And if nothing else, it's almost like, in a way, I've compared her to Freud a few different ways in this respect, of sort of starting the general conversation in this whole area. And so the historical relevance of this model is highly significant to our understanding of death and the psychological experiences of all those affected by it. Okay, so I want to spend a significant portion of today's time talking about coping with death and trying to take a really kind of deep and honest look at this. Most psychologists believe that both the dying individual and significant others know that death is imminent, so that they can interact and communicate with each other on the basis of this mutual knowledge is important. And there's 4 advantages. So this is kind of this idea of like, one of the things we've learned from some of the literature in psychology and in developmental psychology, specifically looking at the experience of end of life, is there's things that we can learn that can help. And there's reasons why this communication is important, and talking about some of these things are important. Because, and this is just sort of what I'm talking about here, there's four advantages of this open awareness for the dying individual. First, it allows dying individuals to close their lives in accord with their own ideas about proper dying. It allows them to kind of have the ending they want. Second, it may allow them to complete some plans or projects, or make arrangements for survivors, or participate in decisions about funeral and burial. So like basically giving them the dignity of taking care of the details that will allow them to have peace. Third, dying individuals have the opportunity then to reminisce and converse with others who have been important to them, and to end life conscious of what life has been like. And fourth, dying individuals have more understanding of what's happening within their bodies and what the medical staff is maybe doing or asking of them. So it's important, this communication piece. From the psychoanalytic perspective, the death of a loved one is an emotional trauma. As with any trauma, the ego or mind tries to insulate itself from the unpleasant emotion such losses induce through the use of defense mechanisms, including denial and repression. Freud believed that defense mechanisms, however, were only temporary devices for dealing with negative emotions. Eventually, the individual must examine the emotions and their source directly. Otherwise, such emotions lead to the development of physical symptoms and perhaps mental illness. Freud's view has been very influential in grief counseling and in popular notions about the necessity of working through grief in order to avoid its long-term effects, right? He called that catharsis, working through that emotion, processing. Psychoanalytic-based grief therapy for children often emphasizes the use of defense mechanisms other than denial and repression to cope with grief. Examples include sublimation, which is like taking the energy from that pain and expressing it through something positive like art. rather than more negative defense mechanisms. Some therapists advocate encouraging children to use identification to manage grief by watching popular films depicting other children's grief, for a normalization effect. The psychoanalytic perspective has shaped grief research by characterizing the loss of a loved one as trauma. So let me just start off by reading this quote. Although we know that after such a loss, the acute state of mourning will subside, we also know that we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it may be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else, and actually that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating that love which we do not want to relinquish. So, when I was making this presentation today, I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with this quote, because I found this quote and I wanted to talk a little bit about Freud's view of it. I found this quote, all of a sudden I looked into it a bit and had the thought of, okay, well, first of all, I felt like I had heard of Ludwig Binswanger before, but it didn't totally click. So I looked into who he was, and okay, so he's a Swiss psychiatrist, so it makes sense. They're in the same part of the world. They're dealing with the same kind of things. He's an early pioneer in the field of existential psychology. I started to just look a little bit more into this. Okay, so what's the loss being talked about in this quote? And the loss being talked about in this quote is Freud reflecting on losing his daughter to the Spanish flu. And so I found an awesome article on it that I want to share with you. So I just wanted to take a second here and show you a picture of Freud with his daughter. In this article, I have linked here, if you download the PowerPoint and click on Jennifer Delgado. I was unfamiliar with her before today, but you'll see me. I have another one of these things where I did a screen share of me reviewing the article, and I just added the video straight into this, so it's just one big file. Hopefully that makes it a little bit smoother for all you students that I'm making this for, obviously, right? But anyways, the point I was going to just say there is, you'll notice it a couple times in the video on the slide coming up, I compliment the fact that Jennifer Delgado in this article does a fascinating job of presenting Freud. Maybe I should just say it like that. So I was looking into the backstory of a quote from Freud I wanted to use in a lecture that was talking about grief, and in a lecture talking about death, dying, and bereavement as an endpoint for a course on developmental psychology, and came across this article from Jennifer Delgado. I'm not sure if she works directly for Yahoo News, but this was from June 16th, 2020. But it's an awesome article, and I thought it was really interesting and powerful, and links together a lot of the things that we've been covering in the course, and it's just so relevant to developmental psychology and also to this current situation we're in. And this article is looking at when Freud lost his daughter to the Spanish flu. I have the article kind of pinched so that to cut out the ads, but it says on the side there a story that connects the past to the coronavirus, or to coronavirus. So the subtitle you can't see just says a story that connects the past to the coronavirus. You see here a picture of Freud with his family. Yes, that caption, Sigmund Freud and his family in 1898. Sophie Freud is the little girl on the left when she was 5 years old.
This afternoon we received the news that our sweet Sophie in Hamburg had been snatched away by influenza, snatched away in the midst of glowing health from full and active life as a competent mother and loving wife, all in 4 or 5 days, as though she had never existed. It is a distant voice that echoes our reality. It brings us face to face with our vulnerability and the terrifying possibility of losing loved ones. These are the words that Sigmund Freud wrote to Pastor Oskar Pfister in a letter dated 27 January 1920 to tell him that the so-called Spanish flu had snatched his daughter away from him. The devastating effect had the unexpected. Sophie was Freud's fifth daughter and probably his favorite. She softened her father's autocratic character, and as she grew up, she invoked feelings of admiration in him, according to his biographers. At the age of 20, Sophie Freud had married Max Halberstadt, a photographer from Hamburg. Nevertheless, despite the distance, she always maintained an intense correspondence with her father, who kept up with his daughter's joys and sorrows. Sophie had 2 boys, but a third seemingly unwanted pregnancy weakened her and paved the way for the virus that was sweeping across Europe to take hold of her. She died on 25 January 1920 at the age of 26. Try to not jump too much with the scrolling. Her death was a severe blow to the father of psychoanalysis, who came to recognize that although he had mentally prepared himself for the death of his sons, who had been drafted to the Great War, he was not prepared for his daughter to be snatched away. Losing a loved one is always painful, but losing them suddenly is even more so, because as Seneca said centuries before, what is quite unlooked for is more crushing in its effect, and unexpectedness adds to the weight of a disaster. Let me read that Seneca quote again. What is quite unlooked for is more crushing in its effect, and unexpectedness adds to the weight of a disaster. See, this author's excellent. She's kind of going between Freud's points and contextualizing it in a way that I just really appreciate. The unexpectedness is exactly what is dealing us the greatest blow in this crisis, what has left us with nothing to hold on to, with no cardinal directions to guide us. Many people have seen their relatives get sick quickly and leave them in a matter of hours. These unexpected deaths makes everything seem like a nightmare. We live through them with a sense of unreality that clears up at times when the pain breaks through. Sudden losses make it difficult for us to accept that the person is no longer with us. They make it even more difficult for us if such a thing were possible. No chance to say goodbye. This goes back to a quote. Although we've been worried about her for a couple days, we've nevertheless been hopeful. It is so difficult to judge from a distance, and that distance had to remain distance. We were not able to travel immediately as we had intended after the first alarming news, because there were no trains, not even for an emergency. The clear brutality of our time is weighing heavily upon us. Tomorrow she will be cremated. Freud's words are a very distant mirror, but they perfectly reflect the pain of many people who saw their loved ones disappear behind the doors of an intensive care unit or an ambulance on its way to the hospital, and who were not given a chance to hug them or hold their hand again during their final moments. Not having a chance to say goodbye causes great anguish that in the long term can lead to feelings of guilt. We start blaming ourselves for what happened in an attempt to make sense of a sudden death that we find difficult to accept and understand, while the world around us becomes increasingly confusing, chaotic, and alienating. This is why Freud's story is also the story of those who had to accept something that until recently had become unthinkable, that someone could die without their loved ones by their side to accommodate them on their final journey, that their funeral would be brief, silent, and deserted, with only 3 people to fill the emotional vacuum and 10 minutes to say goodbye to an entire life. The fact that the coronavirus, just like the Spanish flu, can take not only our loved ones, but also something as essential as saying goodbye and supportive hugs, which we may receive too late, or which will not be strong enough to break through the screams from behind which we try to send them. That's incredible writing. We must not forget that the funeral rituals fulfill very important psychological functions. It helps us to become aware of our loss so that we can start the mourning process. It gives us the chance to receive the love and support of others, to confirm that although we lost someone, we still have others by our side. And lastly, that's an awesome point. And lastly, it fills that deep-seated need to know that the body of the person we love has been treated and sent off with dignity. When both the person and the farewell rituals are taken away from us, we experience a double loss, double the pain, double the anger. See, it's interesting how she's, I forget the person's name, but I'll put it in the video. Incredible writer. This is incredible. Sewing together of these ideas. So how did Freud deal with the pain of losing his daughter? At first, Freud was devastated. He wrote to the husband of the deceased daughter that it was a senseless and brutal stroke of fate, stating that they could only bow their heads under the blow like the poor, helpless creatures we are, mere playthings for the higher powers. That's Freud saying that. His words give a glimpse of that initial period of mourning when we resist accepting the loss and feel immense anger because something extremely valuable that we would have always liked to have with us has been taken away from us. Freud too wavered between the need to accept a painful reality and the desire to reject it, precisely because it was too painful. Let's read that sentence again. Freud too wavered between the need to accept the painful reality and the desire to reject it, precisely because it was too painful. He took refuge in his work. His work was his salvation, and he acknowledged, I do as much work as I can, and I'm grateful for the distraction. As for mourning, that will no doubt come later. Freud, who had always been very attached to his routines, found in them a comfort and way to escape the pain that gripped him, even if only for a few hours a day. Finding comforting routines to keep our minds occupied will help us cope with the loss and give our unconscious time to process what's happened. Again, another great point. That's the author's point. It's no coincidence that it was during this period that Freud published the book that would mark a turning point in his theory. It's no coincidence that during this time period, Freud published the book that would mark a turning point in his theory, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It is likely that he took advantage of the chaos that surrounded him to reflect on to reflect on the human essence, later manifesting in his work. The deaths from the Great War, the rampage of the Spanish flu in Vienna, and even the death of his own daughter must have left a very strong impression that led him to reconstruct the model of the psyche that he had proposed and to which he made every effort to include Thanatos, or the death instinct. Some critics have said that this book was his most confusing work, albeit his most intimate, right? So it's like most confusing, but also his most deep. In a way, writing about death seems to be a way of regaining control after the disrupting experience of death, of reassuring continuity in the face of discontinuity, of mastering the absence, suggested Elizabeth Bonfried. Freud found a way to channel those losses, the chaos and the suffering of the world around him, and that helped him move forward. From pain to acceptance. Little by little in time, acceptance also came. 9 years later, and this is the quote I'm using in the presentation, Freud sent a letter to Ludwig Binswanger, who was an early, he was a psychiatrist and an early person in existential psychology. That letter he wrote, my daughter who died would have been 36 today. So it said higher. I think that she died at 26, so 10 years after. So that's another layer of context for that quote, 10 years after. And this is a quote. We know that the acute sorrow we feel after such a loss will run its course, but also that we will remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what comes to take its place, even should it fill that place completely, it yet remains something else. And that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating a love that we do not want to abandon. Freud always wore a tiny locket with a photo of his daughter inside it, and he looked at it every so often. Nothing could take her place. He knew it, and so do we. We know that the arrival of another person will never take the place of the one who left us, and that's the way it should be. But we should also be aware that mourning will be softened and transformed into nostalgia. With the passage of time, whenever we remember the person who's no longer there, their memory will no longer evoke the pain, but instead a bittersweet feeling that can even be comforting for us. Freud's story drives home the fact that no matter how great the pain we feel today, acceptance and consolation will come in the end with reassurance of knowing that although a loved one may have been taken from us, nothing can take away the memories we've shared together. And that's what we must hang on to. Take care.
So in the early stages of the course, in the part that we did in the fall, I had talked about attachment theory, and we talked about John Bowlby's work and his work specifically with Mary Ainsworth, where they established the whole idea of attachment theory. But Bowlby also worked with a woman named Catherine Sanders, and they were looking at this idea of how intense grief reactions are likely to occur at the loss of any person to whom one is attached. Their theories predicted that the quality of attachment to the loved one should be related in some way to the experience of grief. That the stronger the attachment between a mourner and the lost one, the deeper and more prolonged the grief response was their expectation. Bowlby proposed 4 stages of grief, and Catherine Sanders, another attachment theorist, has proposed 5 stages that overlap with Bowlby's. Okay, so here I'm gonna just, sorry, I gotta just flip this. Yeah. So basically there's 4, and then what I'm gonna say is just that Sanders suggested this idea that you could actually split 4 into the 4th one into 2. So the first one here, shock or numbness, that death at first seems unreal, and then there's this feeling of an awareness of loss or yearning, that there's this common experience of anger as people search for the loved one, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally. And when it says search for, sometimes that means like, you know, all of a sudden you're just going back to your own hometown where you used to go with that person, and it's like there's some, you feel almost physically drawn to maybe a place. I'm not sure why that's the example I thought of, but that then there's this stage of disorganization and despair. That the restlessness of the previous period starts to disappear and gets replaced by this almost a lethargy of despair. So the resolution, or the end of this grieving process, comes in the stage that Bowlby called reorganization. Sanders hypothesized that this stage comprised actually 2 periods, one that's healing and one that's can be understood as renewal. So that the person goes through the shock and numbness, then this awareness of the loss, then this period of intense despair, and then this attempt to heal and become renewed. So it's interesting that what Sanders is making the philosophical argument for is that reorganization needs to be understood as a two-part process that is both healing and then also creating the new, well, renewal, or what that really means is just a new path forward. The outcome for both perspectives is that the individual begins to take control again. The dual process model takes a different approach to grief. So I wanted to show you this too, because this is Strobe and Schutt, and it's kind of an interesting idea. These are two psychologists, the developers of this model, that propose that bereaved individuals alternate between an emotional state in which they confront their loss and actively grieve, which they called confrontation, and they switch between confrontation and another one in which they focus on trying to move forward with their life, which they called restoration. It is likely, or sorry, let me start that again. It is important to not lose sight of the fact that loss can also lead to growth. The way we respond to it is likely to depend on the patterns we establish from early childhood. Our temperament, our personality, our internal working models of attachment and self, our intellectual skills, the social networks we've created. Ultimately, we respond to death, our own or someone else's, as we responded to life. Let me read that last line again, just because it took me like 3 tries there. Ultimately, we respond to death, our own or someone else's, as we responded to life. It's a strong point, right? Because the sentence that preceded it, the way we respond is likely to depend on the patterns we establish from early childhood, our temperament, our personality, our internal working models of attachment and self, our intellectual skills, the social network we created, us. And that the dual process is this back and forth between confrontation and restoration. So there's 2 really important terms that I want to present here, and then there's a video I've included here that I think the woman who's in this video is a family therapist, and I want you to give the video a chance and watch, because I think that she does a really good job. And I think it's also a video that you could show somebody else that you think might be dealing with this thing that's considered complicated grief, or when, for reasons that are complex, they're experiencing blockages to what we would consider quote unquote more normal or regular grieving. Complicated grief or prolonged grief, where sufferers feel numb or detached. They may believe life is empty without the deceased, may feel the future has no meaning. They may have this grief that's more intense than normal, and that oftentimes there's relationship-based triggers for that. And again, I just want to kind of present these terms, and the next video is going to go deep into this. And then the other one is this idea of disenfranchised grief, or when people experience grief over things they never maybe had a chance to mourn. And I gave the example before of like people that lost a loved one maybe during coronavirus and never got to go to the funeral. That would be a textbook example of disenfranchised grief.
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about complicated grief and how it differs from regular grief. But before I jump into that, are you new to my channel? Welcome! I am a licensed therapist making mental health videos on Mondays and on Thursdays, so make sure you have your notifications turned on so that you don't miss out. But now let's hop into today's topic. And it's important, as always, I want to define things, so it's important to first know that grief itself is the natural reaction to loss. It's the body and mind's way of healing wounds caused by loss of something precious. We tend to think of it mostly as intense sorry, but it can present itself as a lot of different emotions or thoughts or even physical symptoms. The important thing to know about grief is that while it can feel awful, it is a healthy and adaptive process of healing. It's just your brain's way of making sense of the loss, and it helps us to learn what we value and leads us to reach out for comfort and relationship. So in a way, grief is really just a helpful tool for processing the loss. Now, complicated grief, on the other hand, can feel very similar to grief, but it is in fact very different from it. While grief is an adaptive process of making sense of a loss, complicated grief is actually a disruption of the grieving process. It keeps you from processing a loss. It's like a complete roadblock. Grief involves positive feelings and memories, and complicated grief generally makes it tough to be able to access the memory or loss in a way that enables you to have a positive or honoring feeling. Also, grief is a reaction to losing something you value. Complicated grief is a reaction to the negative thoughts or feelings that we have about some element of the loss. Almost like the loss stirred something up inside of us and it feels icky, and the thoughts that we have about it are all negative. That's where complicated grief comes out of. And overall, if that doesn't make sense, just know that complicated grief is really born out of a negative belief or experience that we've attached to the loss. It could be a negative belief that we have about ourselves, or possibly the relationship that we had with the person who's passed away or is no longer in our lives. Instead of processing the loss, complicated grief keeps us stuck in the process, unable to do the healing work of grieving. A better way of explaining this is if we talk about the loss like it's a physical wound. Grieving is the healthy process of that wound healing. It's the cleaning out of the wound through experiencing and processing the different losses associated with that wound. It feels painful at first, if you have a cut on your leg, you put rubbing alcohol or hydrogen peroxide on it and you're like, ooh, it really hurts. And then if we're processing it, it can get kind of confusing and it can be hard at times. But this whole grief process is necessary if we want the wound to heal fully. Does that kind of make sense? And complicated grief, on the other hand, is when that wound becomes infected, or you kind of keep tearing out the sutures. I love the band The Postal Service, and I just couldn't help myself, had to add that in. But anyways, during complicated grief, you are still feeling pain and confusion, but it's caused not by the wound itself, but by the infection that has gotten into the wound. For example, let's say you have suffered the loss of a person or relationship that is really important to you. The grieving process would be the emotions and the thoughts and the physical responses, they can often be uncomfortable, that come as your mind works to make sense of that loss. Complicated grief is the interruption of that process. So instead of being able to honor the person or thing that was lost, some narrative, like I was talking about, all those negative thoughts or beliefs we maybe have about ourselves, is going to distract and stop that. And so instead of the grief narratives, which are rooted in the loss and might sound like, why did this happen to me? Or I miss the way that they cared for me, or I don't want to do this without them. Instead, a complicated grief narrative might be something like, people who cry are babies, or this is all my fault. I deserved this. I'm so weak. Or even narratives caused by other losses in our life, like everyone is always leaving me, or this is always happening. Does that make sense? It's like instead of having a healthy thought and belief and story we tell ourselves about the grief, complicated grief prevents it and almost makes it personal, where we did something to cause it. And so, of course, we're not going to be able to process it and move forward. Now, as far as the emotions side, they may feel very similar, especially in the beginning. When you lose someone or you're grieving, you feel sad, angry, hopeless, maybe even depressed. But these emotions are not rooted in working through the loss, and over time, it'll become clear that you're just stuck in a cycle. You're responding to that maladaptive narrative you had, which maladaptive narrative is just like a therapist-y way of saying, that unhealthy story you keep telling yourself about the loss, like all those beliefs that we're having, right? So we can, respond to that rather than ever being able to respond to the actual loss we're facing, which is really why we can't process it. Does this all make sense? I hope so. So if we think this is happening to us, what could have caused it? Why would we have complicated grief versus regular grief? Now, there are a lot of things that can cause it. It could be, number one, and the most common, is unresolved past grief or trauma, especially from childhood. When you're a kid, sometimes you experience injuries that you don't yet have the language or cognition to even process. These things can be triggered or resurface when something happens in your life. And the second cause is loss you feel responsible for. Like you did something to cause this. Like I said, some of those maladaptive or negative thoughts that we can have can be like, people always leave me. This is all my fault. I did something. So that can obviously lead to complicated grief as well. And number three, it could be from invalidated loss. And invalidated loss occurs when you feel your grief is, disproportionate to the situation, meaning you really think you're overreacting and you're judging your grief instead of allowing yourself to feel it and validating the experience. And this could be because of the circumstances surrounding the loss or the ways others react to your loss or the culture in your family about grief. It can happen when you compare losses or when certain emotions in the grief process feel off limits to you in your mind. For example, you feel guilty about anger or have a belief system that makes you feel weak for really feeling sad and missing someone. And complicated grief can also occur when you find yourself in a situation involving delayed grief. So this is the fourth potential cause of complicated grief. And delayed grief is when circumstances make it difficult to process the loss as it happens. Maybe you're busy planning a funeral, or you have to care for someone else's experience of the same loss, so you aren't able to fully process your own. And I remember, honestly, when my dad passed away, my mom was sort of in this weird trance during the whole process because she had to make sure that all the finances were in order and she had to plan the funeral. And she was also consoling me and being there for other members of the family. And there was just so much to do that I think it almost just distracted her from her own loss. Another source might be ambiguous or hidden loss. Some losses are invisible, like losing a child to miscarriage. When loss isn't seen or acknowledged by others, you can end up experiencing complications. Or the sixth cause is compounded losses. When multiple losses occur around the same time, it can make it challenging to process each one. And number 7, sudden, lingering, or violent loss. Essentially, these kinds of injuries are often being experienced as what we would call a traumatic loss. Recurring losses, or losses that are disruption of some sort of essential belief or thought you have about yourself, can create trauma and, essentially, in the end, create complicated grief. Meaning that if the loss seems to go against what you feel you truly are, it could be as simple as always believing that you are strong and independent. But if our grief makes us feel weak and lost without someone, it goes against what we believe about ourselves. Do you know what I mean? And that can lead to complicated grief. Okay, enough about that and the causes. Let's move into how we can know if we're struggling with complicated grief. So identifying complicated grief can be tricky because at times it can look very similar to regular grief. Not to mention that we don't just want to start thinking we have a mental illness when we're just doing something as normal and healthy as grieving. Now, since complicated grief is in the DSM, remember, it's not the end-all be-all, but it just gives us a way to better define and diagnose and treat certain mental illnesses. But in the DSM, it's called Persistent Complex Bereavement Disorder, or PCBD. And it's included in the DSM as a condition that needs further study, precisely because it is so complicated. And if you remember, I did a video a long time ago about non-suicidal self-injury, and that was in that same portion of the DSM, under conditions that need further research. And so what that means is that we might find it in the next update of the DSM. Now, in order for someone to struggle with PCBD, we must have experienced the death of a loved one at least 6 months previous, and at least one of the following symptoms has to be happening longer than expected, okay? So that has to be going on. And then we have to have at least one of these things, okay? And obviously, when we're assessing this, we have to take into consideration a person's social or cultural environment, because different people of religions and backgrounds and cultures have different grieving processes and what's considered, quote unquote, normal. Okay, but they have to have at least one of these. Number 1, intense and persistent yearning for the deceased. Number 2, frequent preoccupation with the deceased. 3, intense feelings of emptiness or loneliness. 4, recurrent thoughts that life is meaningless or unfair without the deceased. And 5, a frequent urge to join the deceased in death. And in conjunction with those, we also have to have at least 2 of the following. And these must have been occurring and been recorded for at least 1 month, okay? And the first one is feeling shocked, stunned, or numb since a loved one's death. Number 2, feelings of disbelief or inability to accept the loss. Number 3, rumination about the circumstances or consequences of the death. Number 4, anger or bitterness about the death. Number 5, experiencing pain that the deceased suffered or hearing and seeing the deceased. Number 6, trouble trusting or caring about others. Number 7, intense reactions to memories or reminders of the deceased. And number 8, and finally, avoidance of the reminders of the deceased, or the opposite, where we'll seek out such reminders so we can feel closer to them. Now, in order to diagnose, symptoms would need to create substantial distress for the sufferer or impact significantly on areas of functioning and cannot be attributed to other causes. Just like all other diagnoses, in order for them to be a real issue, they have to impair our ability to function. I've talked about that a lot in all of my other DSM diagnoses videos. But also know that grieving can still involve complicated emotions that you may not like, but they are about the loss and not about you, and not about the grief itself. What I mean is, don't think it's complicated grief just because it's extremely painful and there are mixed emotions. Trust me, I feel like everything I've had to grieve, every person I've lost in my life, has created mixed emotions and it's been really uncomfortable. And these complications that we're talking about when it comes to complicated grief are the things that are keeping you from healing and grieving. So the question to consider is what you're experiencing helping you mourn the loss? Or is it keeping you from even thinking about the loss? And if you think you might be dealing with complicated grief, please reach out to a therapist or other mental health professional in your area. They can really help you figure out what's interrupting the grief process for you and help you move past it so you're able to process the grief you're feeling. And one type of therapy that's known to help with this is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. In CBT, your therapist will work with you to identify the narratives. Remember those faulty beliefs or guilt? Anyways, they'll help you identify the ones that are interrupting your grieving process. Then they will help you identify what these faulty beliefs are rooted in and either help you work through them or separating them out from the loss so that it can be processed separately. Because let's say it was a trauma that's causing your complicated grief, we'd want to process through that trauma first and then get into the grieving process. But overall, the important thing to know is that complicated grief is very, very common. And it can and will get better. So please reach out, because if it's left untreated, complicated grief can lead to other mental health issues that would need their own treatment, such as depression or anxiety. And finally, I want to just get into something that you can use today to help you begin this process. And one way to do that is to start working through past losses. I offer this up as an option because it can be easier to start with something you aren't currently struggling with. Just like when we go to process through trauma, we may start off with a smaller, less emotionally charged portion of that first. So take a few minutes and think through some of the losses you've experienced in your life. Do you feel like you've done all the work of working through those losses? If not, maybe carve out some time this week to journal through those losses and see what emotions or narratives, those nasty stories we tell ourselves about it, see what comes up for you. And remember to be compassionate about this process and ensure you're talking kindly to yourself as you work through it. Loss is really hard. So try to pay attention to the thoughts you have when you start thinking about your loss. Are these thoughts about the loss? Or are they things that might be about yourself and what's keeping you from actually facing the loss? Then take some time to think about the loss itself. What do you miss about that person? What do you feel about that loss? As you process, just try to notice any thoughts that arise when you think about the loss. Those can be clues to what may be preventing you from grieving fully. Even identifying these will help you make more space in the process for your loss and resolve the complications. I hope you found this video helpful. If you want to know more, you can check out the links below and let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced complicated grief. And if so, how did you know that's what it was? Or how did you work through it? Leave those in the comments below because you never know who you're going to help. And I will see you next time. Bye.
Funerals, wakes, and other death rituals provide several psychological functions. They help family members manage their grief by giving them a specific set of roles to play, social roles to play, providing shape to the first few hours and days. They bring family members together. They can strengthen family ties. They can clarify new lines of influence or authority within a family and pass on the flame in some ways to the next generation. They may help survivors understand the meaning of death itself, in part by emphasizing the meaning of the life the person of the person that died. They may give some transcendent meaning to death itself by placing it in philosophical or religious context. So again, I don't mean it as some like passing comment about how I'm concerned for people that didn't get to properly grieve their loved ones. It's brutal. So widowhood applies to both men and women. The experience of widowhood appears to have both immediate and long-term effects on the immune system. The immune system functions were suppressed somewhat immediately after death, but in some cases had not returned to normal even a year later. The bereaved may continue to suffer at a biochemical level even after obvious signs of grief have subsided. Think about that for a second. That a widowed spouse, can be showing biochemical signals of suffering. Right, like suppressed immune activity, heightened cortisol levels, if we want to be more specific. Immune system functions are suppressed somewhat immediately after death. In the year following bereavement, the incidence of depression among widows and widowers raises substantially, while rates in death and disease rise only slightly. Yes, so there's widows and widowers, and widowhood is, well, in the years following bereavement, I just want to read the rest of my point here, because I want to link this with mental health. In the year following bereavement, the incidence of depression among widows and widowers raises substantially. During the 2.5-year study, they found no difference between the widowed and the non-widowed on global measures of physical and mental health. They did, though, note a rise in depression. So it's very specifically depression. Yeah, it's interesting because in the study that is referenced in I pulled this from the textbook there. They actually looked at a whole bunch of mental health variables, and it is like specifically depression. And again, when you actually like step back and think of the context, it makes complete sense that would be what the finding is. It's almost self-evident. And again, I think one of the reasons I included the family therapist woman on the couple slides ago was because I thought she did an excellent job at sort of talking about this idea of, or of modeling how to talk about these complicated things, because it's easy to see how someone would take a term like pathological grief the wrong way, but it's really a specific term that's looking at this idea of when it starts to really get in the way of somebody's ability to function in their life, and at a certain point you have to live your life. And again, it feels really hard to ever tell somebody that, well, how do you call someone on their pain? It's like grieve, and it's not about that. That's not what I mean. But I think one way you can think about it is almost like how we would think about what the difference between depression and clinical depression is. That's sort of similar to what the difference between grief and pathological grief is. What's pathological is the effect on the ability to live life, take care of yourself, hold the job, well, depending on the life stage, right? But this idea of, well, grief symptoms for more than 2 months following the loss of a loved one. Grief lasting longer than 6 months can lead to long-term depression, physical ailments. Problems may continue for up to 2 years. But again, it's like, And I feel like at this stage in the course and at this stage in the presentation, we're like over 2 hours in, you know what I mean, that I'm not trying to say that people don't have a right to grieve in their own way. They do. But if you're trying to help somebody or yourself or your loved one, sometimes there's a point where the way that the emotions and thought processes are being experienced are becoming maladaptive to the person's ability to function.
To get back to suffering and despair, sometimes it seems that some people seem to have a much heavier load than others. Do these people not feel after a while, can I still continue to take meaning?
You wouldn't believe it. It comes to mind that there is a specific statistical, strictly empirical study that was published a couple of years ago by two famous psychologists. And it turned out, by way of not only of statistics, but by test batteries, that people prone to death, who knew that they were dying soon, had a higher sense of meaning than normal populations. And if I tell you the story that the dean of the School of Nursing at the University of Texas, in the Texas Medical Center in Houston, a famous center, she wrote me of a case of a young girl, very young girl, about 17 years of age or so, who was paralyzed totally, also up to her neck, and could only, by use of a mouth stick, type letters. And Dean Stark, that nurse, told me within 3 lines, I remember this letter, she told me that that girl is reading newspapers day by day, watching television, and as soon as she comes across an individual in a tragic life situation, she types with the mouth stick on the typewriter letters offering them consolation and comfort. And she has some credibility, believe me. And she, the Dean Stark, says she's full of confidence. She has a strong sense of abundant meaning in her life, while others who cannot see meaning under the best conceivable of conditions take their lives because they are frustrated. They are caught in an existential vacuum, in a sense of meaninglessness and emptiness. I have described it in a book of mine as soon as in 55. Since that time, it has ever more been increasing worldwide. You find you are facing it not only in Western countries, you are facing it in the so-called third world, you are facing it in communist states, and communist psychiatrists also describe it in their literature. What Frankl tells us about this existential frustration is also observable in the communist countries.
So are you saying that in order to find meaning, it is necessary to experience suffering?
I wouldn't say it is necessary to experience suffering. What I say is just that meaning can be found under each and every condition in life, even under the worst conceivable conditions, provided that it is a situation you cannot change. Remember, I said this explicitly. That means, provided that the cause of your suffering cannot be removed. If you can remove the cause of a suffering, say in case of a cancer, by surgery, you have to undergo surgery. If you are suffering from a severe compulsive obsessive neurosis, you have to seek psychotherapeutic help. There are, within the realm of logotherapy, for instance, certain techniques that can be applied with much success, as has been evidenced not by logotherapists but by behaviorists. And finally, if you are confronted with sociological conditions that have caused your suffering, then you are called upon to change the situation, to remove the cause of your suffering by political action, for instance. But in this respect, I would like to make another additional statement by telling you something that I, a couple of weeks ago, have told my professors and students forming my audience at the Karl Marx University in Moscow. I was invited by the prorector to stay there for a month and to lecture there on my teachings, but I had only time for 2 days. And I told them, don't think that I came to you from the West in order to sell you any political opinions. No, I don't come as a politician, but I speak to you on a meta-political level. This means that I recognize only, on a worldwide scale, only 2 styles of politics, or 2 types of politicians. The one is he, the politician, who thinks that the end justifies the means, any means, while the second type remains fully aware that there are means that would desecrate even the most noble end. And they were applauding that and understanding. And so I don't come into any country with a preconceived political conviction. I'm not entitled to judge it, but I have the responsibility to accept any call wherever in the world to deliver a message, if any should be present, and to act as an MD, as a doctor of medicine, and as such I had to take the Hippocratic oath that compels me to try to offer a cure to each and every individual or also population, if they invite me to do so.
Dr. Frank, I'm going to ask you now, as you know, this country is going through a very difficult time. We have an economic recession, people have become insolvent or without jobs, the political future is far from settled. Do you have a message for us, a message that could give us hope and meaning?
You see, the only message I can deliver is a principle that I have adopted. I well remember throughout the days I had to spend in Auschwitz. There is statistical evidence that my chance to survive Auschwitz, real statistical evidence, was 29 to 1. And I had the feeling that it was like that. And still, I applied the philosophy of Sir Karl Popper, whose nucleus means that you cannot prove any hypothesis. The only thing you can do is falsify it, show that it is not valid, that it is not tenable. And without knowing his philosophy, I only met him the first time a couple of years ago, I applied this theory inasmuch as I told myself, Victor, the chances are very, very low and small. probably you will be sent to the gas chamber. And still, there is nobody who can guarantee me and convince me with 100% certainty that I shall not survive but end in the gas chamber. As long as I have no guarantee that I will have to die within the next days, I continue behaving and acting as if I would spare this fate.
Dr. Frankel, thank you for...
So thanks for watching this today, and I hope you've gotten something out of this. I think that, like, first of all, I've loved doing this class. I still have more content coming, but this is the last chapter related presentation. But I just wanted to thank you for being an awesome group, and have one last little kind of classic piece of footage to leave you with from the great Dr. Carl Jung. But yeah, I'll see you soon. Later this week, I'll be coming out with the next digital workshop topic, and then that's the last thing that I'll be giving you. So then you basically have your chapter, your quizzes on the different chapters that are all kind of already released. The first digital workshop's been released, and then you have the second one, and then that's it. So I'll do, once I do that assignment presentation, I'll like do a whole like update video and stuff like that. Okay, so we don't have to worry about it right in this exact moment. But you're an awesome class, love yous, take care, and I tried to do my best with that presentation. I hope I was respectful and that you got something from it, and you know, cheers and take care. Reach out if you need anything.
I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth, and like it, it's an integral part of life, but surely it can't be like birth if it's an end, can it?
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, you know, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche, that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. Only ignorance deny these facts. It's quite evident that they do exist and have existed always. Now these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, and obviously it doesn't, then to that extent the psyche is not submitted to those laws. And that means a practical continuation of life, of a sort of psychical existence beyond time and space.
Do you yourself believe that death is probably the end, or do you believe that?
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons, naturally, and should say, we have to reckon with the possibility of so-and-so, you know.
Well, now, you told us that we should regard death as being a goal,
yes,
and that to shrink away from it is to evade life and
yes,
life purposes.
Yes.
What advice would you give to people in their later life to enable them to do this, when most of them must in fact believe that death is the end of everything?
Well, you see, I have treated many old people, and it's quite interesting to watch what the unconscious is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. And so I think it is better for old people to live on, to to look forward to the next day as if he had to spend centuries. And then he lives properly. But when he is afraid, when he doesn't look forward, he looks back, he petrifies, he gets stiff and he dies before his time. But when he is living on, looking forward to the great adventure that is ahead, then he lives. And that is about what the unconscious is intending to do. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything. But nevertheless, there is something in us that doesn't believe it, apparently. But this is merely a fact, a psychological fact. Doesn't mean to me that it proves something. It is simply so. For instance, I may not know why we need salt, but we prefer to eat salt too, because you feel better. And so when you think in a certain way, you may feel considerably better. And I think if you think along the lines of nature, then you think properly.